Did Vivek Ramaswamy catch Nikki Haley in a gotcha moment, or was it something more? Were World War I and II pointless wars? Is it compassionate to affirm transgender identities to your children? We chat about these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through social media and we find the most interesting takes and we tear them apart or build them up and see what lies underneath. My name is Donald and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton. And if you want to follow us on socials, you can do so at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, let's get into the takes. So as we're recording this, the GOP debate was last night. And so there is going to be, I think, two takes roughly around that. And Matt Walsh starts with a tweet saying, Vivek's point is very important. Haley touts her foreign policy experience and yet isn't even familiar with the basic geography of the countries she wants our children to die fighting for. And an individual replies saying, I disagree. It's not important. He looked it up before the debate. She didn't. Pretty obvious gotcha. He wins the point in the debate. Not important for who should be president. What do you take? What do you think of that take?
Well, my first takeaway from what this guy is saying is that Nikki Haley's breadth and extent of her knowledge of foreign policy experience doesn't quite reach. Could have looked it up right before the debate. Right. Vivek was able to look it up before the debate and somehow knew more than Nikki Haley, who's had decades of supposed expertise in this area, expertise that she frequently has tried to use to bash Vivek, who's not been in government, over the head. So there's kind of this like this, the weakest version of this argument is the one that this guy's making. It's very much like, oh, it's my team versus your team. And like, whatever supports my team is what I'm going to keep rooting for. And whatever doesn't is, I can make exceptions for. And a lot of people will use this logic like, oh, it's not important that they didn't get this answer right and such. But I think to address that, like grains of sand in gaps of knowledge create a heap eventually if you keep adding them up. Nikki Haley has like boulders of issues that she's contributed to. But if someone in a basketball game, like if you fail to make a defensive play or you fail to miss a basket once, like, yeah, maybe that's not super important necessarily for the game. But if you continue to do that over and over and over and over, eventually it's like, yeah, you suck at basketball. And Nikki Haley's inability to know where the places she wants to bomb on the map are, as well as all of the foreign policy calls she's made over the past 2 decades and has gotten wrong, her and all of the neocons, those are grains of sand that end up making a heap. Those are the missed baskets and the missed plays that make me say, hey, maybe you actually do suck at this, or you have an ulterior motive. And I happen to think she has an ulterior motive, and her expertise is not actually in foreign policy per se, but it's really just in figuring out how to create wars to enrich herself and her buddies in the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that Vivek highlighted when he made this attack, essentially, is he said, they've had over a year to be talking about this and to be championing this viewpoint. Yeah. And that to me is one of the key things, because if this was a matter of, I don't know, Russia had attacked yesterday, it would still be embarrassing for her because she really does tout her foreign policy experience. Like that's the other thing about it is she specifically touts her foreign policy experience. Yeah. This isn't like him just attacking her because he disagrees with her on this viewpoint. He's like, this is her bread and butter, and it's been a year. And if you're actively saying after a year that you want to be invading this country with U.S. troops, or at the very least we should be supporting it militarily, if you haven't in a year taken the time to learn the basic strategy of how this would play out, then it does show what he called intellectual fraud. And like I was saying, if this was like Russia just attacked yesterday, then I would be more sympathetic, because it might be one of those situations where she has a general perspective of saying, okay, peace through strength, and that means that we have to bomb everywhere that has some slight adversity with us or something like that. And so my general perspective is that we need to go in and support them and invade. If this was, again, like a month ago, I wouldn't be, I'd be a little bit like, well, this is your area of expertise, so-called, but whatever, because it's a month. It's been a year. and you're continually touting this position, by this time you should have been able to meet with, military strategists or at least campaign strategists who would say this is the general strategy and plan of attack if you were to support Ukrainian troops with US troops and blah blah blah, and that would include regional knowledge. So to me, this isn't just a gotcha. This isn't just a he looked up the point before. His whole entire point is that she's been advocating this for a year. She's specifically saying that you need to send our US troops into these places, and doesn't have the basic knowledge of what the actual strategy is, because she can't even name the areas in which they would be entering. And I think that that's a huge that's hugely telling, right? It's not just some random detail. It's not just a mini points scenario like this guy's thinking. It's showing that the entire structure of her argument has no foundation of understanding.
Yeah. Exactly. What I was going to add on to what you're saying, like the strength and conviction she has made for her policy remedies over in Ukraine, specifically sending billions upon billions of dollars over there and trying to get involved as much as we can, and then her entire, very hawkish Russian foreign policy. Like, you could almost forgive someone who doesn't have opinions on Ukraine to not know where. Right. Or doesn't have a strong opinion on Ukraine, maybe has an inclination about the whole war, to not know about those areas. But to have such strong opinions, to have such strong policy recommendations, and then not know like the fine details, like you're saying, it totally destroys the foundation of her argument, and it makes her, as Vivek was saying, an intellectual fraud. And a lot of people are drawing comparisons to like Gary Johnson's Aleppo moment back in the 2016 election, where I think it was on CNN, or I can't remember which network it was, but they basically asked him a question about Aleppo, and he kind of had a brain fart, or maybe he didn't know, but he didn't Sorry,
they set him up to some degree. They completely switched topics from what they're talking about, and so it's like out of context, brain fart.
I remember he was like, I think he in a follow-up interview talked about, he's like, I thought they were referring to like an acronym or something like that, because they were talking about some other defense thing.
Yes, they were talking about departments and completely unrelated things to Syria. So it really was a setup for Gary.
Yeah. And so then he was like, hey, what is Aleppo? And then after they said, oh, are you serious? It's in Syria with all this stuff going on. And then after he knew what it was, he was able to lay out a logical argument for why we should not be doing the things that we were doing over in Syria, and what all led to, all the Aleppo things that were going on. But Nikki Haley has been, in contrast to that, has been saying what we should do in the strongest of terms, while also advocating that she and her cronies and the government take all of our money and go fund it. And yet she can't actually work out the details. It's like if you ever had someone go work on your house, like to build a deck or work on some sort of plumbing, and they say, hey, here's a bill for $100,000, to fix this. And they're like, oh, I'm the expert. I feel very strongly that you should be making this change. And then you ask a little bit of questions about like, hey, like, where exactly in the house are you going to be working on these pipes? Like, what kind of pipe are you putting on? Why do we even need to do this in the first place? Or even, what's the address of my house? Right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, I don't know. It's like, oh man, like I don't trust your recommendation anymore. And that's ignoring all of the past policy failures that she's been like a proponent of, that have been disastrous, and we kind of universally agree are not good. So it's just funny to be like, yeah, that maybe in like a vacuum, this moment could be considered like, oh, it's a gotcha moment, and it's a bit unfair. But like when you look at the broader context, especially like you're saying, she kind of like hypes up her foreign policy credentials. It's kind of the only thing she actually relies on, has any claim to fame on. It's actually devastating.
The other thing is, this guy's like, oh, he looked it up before the debate. She didn't. I actually kind of don't think Vivek did. I don't think he looked up provinces before the debate. He strikes me as someone who studies things very intensely and very deeply, and then just kind of remembers them. That, to me, that's evident in even the closing statements. In the really unimportant, kind of lame question they asked all the candidates, what's one former president you would choose to emulate? Like, whose presidency do you want to replicate? And right before Vivek spoke, Ron DeSantis answers Calvin Coolidge. And I have to admit, I'm a little gratified. My heart's like, oh,
same.
Ron, you're trying to appeal to me. I appreciate that. And, he lays out the basics about why Calvin Coolidge is cool. And then it goes to Vivek. And Vivek impresses me even more, because what he says is, well, you picked a president who was born on July the 4th, so I'm going to pick one who died on July the 4th. And then he talks about Thomas Jefferson and brings up Jefferson, which was also an excellent choice and response. But the little bit of him saying, you picked a president who was born on July the 4th tells me that Vivek probably knows way more about Calvin Coolidge than Ron DeSantis did, because Ron DeSantis,
I didn't even know he was born on July 4th, and I like Calvin Coolidge.
He was born on July 4th on Plymouth Notch. That was the town he was born in. There you go. But like, to me, again, that shows that like Vivek knows Calvin Coolidge. He studied him. Maybe he had him as his answer or response, but that's also just such an odd chance that, okay, they both were going to say that and then he switched his answer. Probably not. It's probably just one of those things. And so all that to say, Vivek strikes me as the kind of person who at one point figured, this is important. I'm going to study this and remember that. And so when it comes to what's important to be a president, I would much rather have a president who says, this is important. I'm going to look this up, whether that's the day before or months before, and you happen to remember it. I think in both scenarios, even if it was a gotcha moment, the fact that her prioritization was not strong enough to know that to look this up beforehand is important to being president, because that shows that you have bad judgment.
Yeah,
there's a million things that you need to know to be president, for sure. It's a high bar. I'm not going to try to lower that bar just because, oh, well, it's like, I don't know, war is probably one of the most important things that you can be ready for in this scenario. So yeah, if your judgment says that you don't even need to look this up before the debate, if you don't already know it, which you should, yeah, that's telling to me.
Yeah.
Okay, next tweet. This comes from Alaric the Barbarian, who I'm going to out because they're verified and because this take is funny. The libertarian notion of, quote, let adults do what they want, end quote, is folly and essentially cowardice. If you don't prescribe and enforce norms, someone else will. You have to step up. All right. What do you make of that?
So I actually, Alaric the Barbarian's pretty based on X most of the time. And so I was surprised when I saw this, because there are for sure some libertarians, I mean, we'd maybe call them libertines, who are very much like, hey, let everything goes, you know, the Tiger King wing of the Libertarian Party that just wants all forms of debauchery and immoral actions to be allowed all throughout the land and everything. But a true libertarian or anarchist notion about how things work really draws the line at property rights. I don't think any libertarian would have a problem with someone that owns a property saying, hey, this or that behavior is not allowed or is allowed or encouraged on my property. And that's kind of the principle that all of this stuff stems from. It says, hey, if people can own property, which today we don't really own our property because we pay property taxes. And if we stop paying them, the government can take it from us whenever they want to. They can even take it from us even if we are paying property taxes. But property is the dividing line about what can and cannot go on or be conducted. And it's determined by the property owner. And so when you do away with that principle, yeah, then you are forced to have to go tell people what to do, because there is some authoritarian in charge that makes the rules. But when everything comes back down to property rights and you're able to establish that, and that's core to libertarian philosophy, suddenly like you can have people be free and also enforce at the property level what type of moral norms and cultural standards and various things that as you will. And what's nice about it is that people can now reap the benefits or consequences, and you can see a clear delineation about where those consequences or benefits are occurring, and people can adapt and change their behaviors based upon those. Right now, what we have is someone on the East Coast legislating what can and cannot go on here in Washington. Here in Washington, even, we got people on the western side of the state legislating what people on the eastern side of the state can and cannot do. The cultures are different. The morals are different. What is valued, what kind of industry, what kind of family systems are set up, and church setups and religious setups. Everything is so different, and so it makes absolutely no sense for someone that lives so far away to make that call. And I think we would all take issue with our neighbor being able to tell us what we do in our house. So it makes zero sense to be able to tell people, to feel like at the point of gun, I can prescribe a norm on someone else's property. Yeah, I agree with that. Like that is like I don't agree with that. It makes sense that you should be able to enforce norms and cultural standards on places that you own, and we should hold people to standards. But where and how and who we can do that to is determined by property rights. Like I said, core to libertarian philosophy.
Yeah, I really don't like the idea of him calling it essentially cowardice, because
Yeah.
I think frankly it's actually the reverse, because you're scared that you can't convince people to live in a moral and upright way. You're scared of the consequences of not enforcing your will on other people. So if I think cowardice is such a cheap way to describe another philosophy, because I'm just going to go back and call him a coward. It's like, no, you're the
Yeah.
coward. You have to use a gun in order to make people do what they want, because you're scared of the alternative. You're scared of what they're going to do if you don't tell them what to do at the point of gun. Like, I just don't think that's a fair characterization. Of course, people are always going to be competing for establishing a society of rules and things like that, which is why the entire point of libertarianism is trying to convince people to not do so violently. It's one of those things where just like voting third party, it's you have to convince people like don't use force. And they're like, well, they're going to use it. It's like, yeah, but if you use force, then they're going to use that exact same justification against you. And it's just this never ending war of, they're going to use force, so I have to use it first, race to the bottom, which I think we are slowly seeing unravel in real time with the American Republic, that is becoming more and more a race to the bottom of using the powers that exist to control what you can, and this ever constant cycle of, they used the power last time, so now I'm going to use it and expand it a little more. So to me, it's one of those things where you you have to prescribe and enforce norms. No, not enforce. You have to prescribe norms, but if you're doing so in an unethical manner, then it doesn't really matter, because you've lost your soul and the plot anyway, and then you're only encouraging a society based on unethical means to begin with. It'd be like saying we have to enslave everyone to prevent the idea of like fornication or out, sleeping around or cheating or whatever. We have to enslave everyone to make sure that we track them all, and where everyone is at all times, so that you can keep them perfectly accountable, so that you can make sure that no one's running off and being promiscuous. It's like, at what point do you draw the line of the society that you want, and the norms you have to enforce? Because that to me is the other completely arbitrary thing that people who take this position is. Our position is we should try to convince people to do things rightly without force. Their line is, no, you have to use force in order to set up certain rules. But then the question, of course, is by what standard? Where is the line of what laws ought to be enforced by gunpoint and which ones ought to be enforced by culture? Because a certain, you're not supposed to lie, so if a parent lies to their kid about Santa Claus, should that be enforced? What's the distinction? Is it a lie that harms? Who determines who's the victim of harm? Who determines what harm is? There's all kinds of problems with the idea of enforcing norms, unless you're just willing to defer that power to an arbitrary bunch of people, which is what I would argue kind of the U.S. has done in a democratic republic system we have. And yeah, I think it is not proving to be an experiment that is working.
I can't remember who originated this way of thinking or this argument, but when evaluating the merits and whether a law should be in place, evaluate from the standpoint of, would you be willing for someone to be executed for this law, for violating it and breaking it? And suddenly, like, everything becomes much more clear. And people might say, oh, well, that's like really, that's hyperbole. That's not actually the case. Like, I get a parking ticket and no one comes up to me and shoots me. But if you kind of just play that out all the way to the end, like, I get a parking ticket for parking in the wrong spot, and this is a law enforced by the government upon you. So you're parking on some like city street or something like that, and you haven't paid for your parking. You get a parking ticket and you're like, well, I'm not going to pay for that parking ticket. Then you get another parking ticket, and eventually the fines line up as such that you're now called to court, or there's some sort of action or injunction given against you. And if you don't show up to that, or maybe you do show up to it and you don't accept their prescription of what you're supposed to do, eventually you go all the way down to the line where you're faced with the decision of, I either need to be locked in a cage for X amount of days, or they are going to forcefully, put me there or kill me. One of those few things. And so all laws eventually end up at that point, if given someone doesn't agree with it strongly enough. And I think that like the minarchists will make the case of things like, like murder and like violent crimes and things like that. Like, and I think you and I would both agree that like yeah, like you have a right, regardless of where you are, if you're on someone else's property and you were invited there or anything like that, that you have the ability to defend yourself if someone's trying to hurt you and things like that. And those might be the extent of the types of moral norms and laws that we should enforce. You and I just prefer, I think, to let people enforce that themselves with their own right to defense and things like that. So it's unfortunate is like, it's this belief about libertarian principles that like it's just fornication and hedonism and this do what you may and do what you will, and like there will be no like morals. But it's like I don't think you can actually have a society that truly functions morally for the right reasons unless they are free to make bad decisions and bear the consequences of the decisions. Unfortunately, like the government we have set up right now, and basically all governments, they eventually subsidize and incentivize people's bad behaviors, and there's plenty of examples of that. But in lieu of people being able to bear their own consequences, as well as forcing people to not be able to lay out their moral positions, you're going to have a society that is less free and less moral.
Yeah, one point that William Lane Craig made, that he's a Christian apologist for anyone who doesn't know, that I thought was interesting was he was talking about how he has a deep discomfort with sort of the entwining of the U.S. religious government or excuse me, the U.S. government and religious texts, like the "In God We Trust" on our money. He's like, yeah, he doesn't like that because you've taken these words that are sacred and deep and you've just made them common. You've made them have no importance or relevance or reverence because they're just on the money. It's just everywhere. It's just a thing. And he was contrasting the US, generally speaking, with the separation of church and state, with the quote unquote religious nations of Europe, with their kingdoms and things that were established as Christian nations specifically. And he's saying, one of the advantages of the United States in that it had this separation was that the church had to keep itself strong. It had to be legitimate on its own and convince people and work hard, and not just be this sort of assumed national identity. And so you look at the sort of the secularization of Europe so much quicker than you've seen it in the West, where like England is a still in name Christian state, technically speaking, because the monarchy is a Christian monarchy technically, but it is a much more secular reality. Whereas in the US, it is technically a secular state, but realistically speaking, it is, compared to Europe, a much more Christian and religious nation still. So it's just an interesting thing, and I think that comes to the point here as well, where when you tie your laws and your government to sort of morality and moral principles, you're going to run the risk of diluting it, of forcing people to define that and to twist it into turning the entire nation into sort of a lack of ethics and morals. I think that Alaric the Barbarian probably would prefer. Okay, we'll move to our next one here. This one's a conversation between two individuals on X. First person says, sort of sarcastically, "It's always good to send kids to fight in pointless wars." To which we have a reply that reads, "World War I and World War II were two pretty non-pointless wars. You fascists might think you can be isolationist. You can't. You keep breaking promises to your partners, no one believes you, and you go from America first to America alone. Suicide. Hope you know Chinese." And then he continues, "Both of them were worsened by our reluctance to do what needed to be done in advance of it. It's a lot cheaper to fund Ukraine in lives and cash to send their children to fight for their security versus sending our own. But you fascists are so short-sighted." We have a reply from the original poster who says, "World War II was a direct result of the ending of World War I." To which the other guy replies, "Much more complicated than that. Europe and US tried to appease a madman. And that's what you're doing by not funding Ukraine and letting Putin continue his war of aggression. Do you really think he's going to stop with Ukraine and no one will trust the US again?" And then again, we have a reply from the original poster who says, "Yes, because pretty much everything around there besides Ukraine is in NATO." And then the last guy replies once more, "Now you're getting it. Letting Ukraine fall means right next door to them are our partners where we are required to defend them unless you're going to break your word to them as well. And then we become America alone because no one trusts us." Okay. All right. Let's dissect this. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so there's obviously a lot going on here. I thought we're recording this right now on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and there's a lot of discussion about isolationism and whether there were good wars or bad wars, and it's kind of universally accepted that World War II was a good war for us to be involved in. Some people also think that about World War One, but less so.
Which is crazy.
Which is crazy because it was like the biggest waste of lives ever.
Yeah.
Up in that point until that point in history. So, one of the things that really got me about we're critiquing the guy that's obviously very pro send lives and money to Ukraine. It was when he says you go from America first to America alone, and then he talks about NATO and how if we break our word to the NATO countries, then like we're going to be cut. No one will trust us, and like the whole founding of America and what made us so awesome and so stable and so peaceful for so long was that we avoided entangling alliances as the founding fathers prescribed when they founded this country. They're like, hey, all those folks over in Europe and all over the world, like they fight with each other. Like in order for us to remain free, to not become an empire, let's just stay out of it. Just let those guys over in Europe do their thing. And that lasted not very long until we started getting involved in it. And, the first guy doesn't make the best of points, but he is correct that World War II was a direct result of our involvement in World War One. So, in Europe, kind of the economy of war, as you would have it, was that like everyone would fight. They'd inevitably get to about a stalemate, especially with like the modern technology that was going on. And then every side would be forced to make concessions. And usually the battle lines and the borders and everything would go relatively back to where they were. And everyone would be forced to compromise to live in peace because everyone just got tired of all the bloodshed. Our entrance into World War One, with the false flag of the Lufthansa and Woodrow Wilson needing to satisfy bankers in the United States, made it so that the scales were very, very tipped in favor of a certain side. And once that side was able to win, they forced the other side to agree to things that they otherwise would have never agreed to do. That other side being Germany, and Germany saying, hey, like all these like war reparations at the Treaty of Versailles, like all these things that you're trying to do, like we're not going to be able to be a nation anymore. Like we will be unstable. We'll have to print money. We'll be paying this debt off. And this is back in the early 1900s until the 1980s. Like obviously not tenable, but because we had tipped the scales so far and we basically handicapped someone and gotten involved where we shouldn't have, now this crazy imbalance of a compromise or lack of compromise was created. And suddenly like it created such instability in Germany that like now you have a really, really, really strong like resentment against the rest of Europe, kind of a chip on your shoulder that you need to take off. And now you have the madman, as this guy calls him, Hitler, rising to power and convincing a lot of other people that were apparently mad that they needed to go fight. And it's like, well, no, like Hitler's a very bad person, definitely somewhat crazy in a lot of ways, and a very evil person. But he was able to appeal to Germans because they were backed into a corner by our treatment of them in World War I by our imbalance. So all of that, like, the guy's argument, like World War II is a direct result of the ending of World War I is true. That also holds to our involvement with Ukraine and the expansion of NATO. And like, it's like, yeah, like we've created this false line on the border of Russia because we basically say in the the NATO treaties is that, hey, if you attack a NATO nation, like you're basically attacking us and we're obligated to defend that nation. And so ergo, we've expanded the US borders all the way to the edge of the Russian borders. Like that, how could that not be perceived as a threat by them? How is that a war of aggression for Russia to feel threatened by that and to make, decisions that are like, you're now with your back against the wall. You have to make certain decisions. I'm not saying that it's an awesome thing that Russia invaded Ukraine and is doing all this stuff. But you can also see that, like, oh yeah, like the U.S. has provoked them and has put Ukraine as a meat shield for our own interest, our own military-industrial complex interest, and the geopolitical interests of our political elite. Is using Ukrainian men and women as a meat shield to gain those types of dollars and cheap political points and a soapbox to stand on at a debate stage. So yeah, our involvement is causing these deaths to happen needlessly. Not to mention all the times we've tried to derail the peace. But anyways, I went for a while. I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, it's all good stuff. I'm happy to keep letting you go on. But yeah, I mean, the only thing that I think also that was so crazy is that this guy's talking about, it's a lot cheaper to fund Ukraine in
Oh
lives
man.
and cash to send their children to fight for versus our own. And this is, it's one of those things where it's easy to it's it's easy to make that argument when you're just talking about money, and it's this continual goalpost shift about, you're sort of fear mongering about, oh well, we have to send money over there because we don't want them at our doorstep, and so then people are like, well, okay, yeah, this could happen, and it ends up being a huge waste of money. Because again, like for all the reasons that you've outlined, like we've provoked them, there's a lot of ridiculousness in the sense that like they're totally outgunned, and in order to save lives we should be making a peace deal even if it's not ideal, but there's a lot of other moving components that we should be doing in order to not provoke aggression in general. And then but now this guy's like callously saying, well, we should also throw their lives at them because it's better than ours. And again, to even respond in such a way, angrily calling everyone, oh, you fascist and blah blah blah, like it just shows how disconnected this person is from the cost of war. Like say,
Yeah.
even if you think this perspective, you shouldn't just say, hey, better them than us. Like kind of, it should be a, hey, like we need to do this, and it's tragic, but it's their war first and foremost. So it's a good thing for us to be supporting them financially to help them do it. Because otherwise we will have to send our lives. Like you could even just phrase it better. But I think that the way that you're communicating about this shows that you actually don't have a regard for the actual lives at stake. You're more interested in being vitriolic online and winning this so-called argument or whatever. And the other thing that's funny too is this guy doesn't really like acknowledge the fact that this guy brings up, how like everything besides Ukraine is in NATO, and he's like, yeah, exactly. It's like he doesn't see the irony of that, of being like, yeah, we're like trying to corner Russia and then act like we're not provoking them, and so you're like, yeah, everything else is around them is in NATO, so like why is that not containment enough? And he's like, no, exactly, we're gonna let them down too. And it's like, no, Ukraine isn't part of NATO.
We made promises we couldn't keep.
Yeah, exactly. Like just because we made a bad promise once does not mean we ought to keep holding on to it. So I don't know. I think that this guy is just he just strikes me as like someone who's watched like TikToks or read online and not like deeply considered these things as a human being, because I don't think you can come to such a callous conclusion or speak in such a callous way or have the facts of like every country surrounding Russia being in NATO and like actually consider those things and react in this kind of way.
Yeah, like we in this scenario, in like a bar fight or something like that, like the United States is the guy with the big muscles leaning over to kind of the weaker guy saying, hey, like why don't you go, make fun of that Russian guy over there, go flick his ear and spill your drink on him and stuff like that. We'll have your back, we promise. It's like, man, those are promises we shouldn't be making. Because one, maybe we can't really enforce them because no one can really enforce them in a fight. Like a fight is a fight. And then two, is that like morally good for us to be doing something like that or morally acceptable? Like, no, it's not. Like we shouldn't be provoking people to do things like that. And a lot of folks like rely on, like, especially this digital warrior or whatever guy, like they rely on us believing that history started back when Ukraine was invaded. It was back in 2021 or whenever it was. And before that, it was when, Putin took over Crimea. And before that, it was his invasion of Georgia. And it's like, yeah, there's no like mention or remembrance of everything that happened in between or before those things, us moving the defensive missiles, right into right onto the border, saying like, oh, well, these are just supposed to shoot down, any incoming missiles. But in reality, they can be converted into Tomahawk missiles to be, be sent into Russia and into Moscow. So like people forget about all those different types of things and think that like, oh yeah, like Ukraine, this peaceful, non-corrupt, easygoing, flowers and rainbows country that has no issues was suddenly invaded by the big evil empire. It's like, no, that's just not how it is. Like once you realize that things are a lot more complicated and that there are actual motivations at play, then you can kind of actually suss out what's going on and realize that like, oh yeah, this is complicated, but there are definitely like wrong things that have occurred on both sides of this. And like, how do we get to peace? And it's just so interesting that people that are very hold this line of thinking are very anti-peace and anti-anything that could ever become a peace. And isolationists are like, hey, we just want there to be peace. Like, yeah, we need to be strong. We need to be able to defend ourselves. And I think that going over into another country and meddling and bombing people and, putting missiles on their border is not a way for us to have peace and keep ourselves safe. It's not actually America first. Yeah, and it's definitely America alone, because at the end of the day, like, we're the only ones left standing in a world that hates us, basically, because we've alienated everyone.
Yeah, I think that these kinds of people tend to also be, and I don't know, maybe, I mean, based on this person's username, I kind of think he's probably one of the people who would espouse to be like, don't tread on me, let me live my life. But when it comes to, meddling with other countries, we should absolutely control and dominate them. Convince Zelensky to not negotiate a peace deal with Putin. Let's cause a bunch of bloodshed in the meantime until eventually, they're going to have to negotiate a peace deal. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a very don't tread on me perspective. Well, it's like, don't tread on me, but I can tread on everyone else. That's okay.
Yep.
All right. Our next take here says, full offense, but if your son lays awake at night wishing he was dead because you insist he's your daughter, or if your daughter lays awake at night wishing she was dead because you insist she's your son, you have failed as a parent. Oh, this is
a terrible take. And
yeah.
What's so funny about this is that I had to read it several times to fully understand, like, which gender they were talking about in each scenario. And it just kind of demonstrates how incoherent this entire philosophy is. Because it's like, it's almost like the genders or biological sex is like, and the understanding of the differences between the two of them is maybe the most foundational truth of ever. Like, especially if you prescribe to like a very more like a pragmatist view of the world and morals. It's like, if you don't believe that truth of a fundamental difference between male and female, like, you don't have a society. Like, there are no parents, there are no children, there is no way to propagate, there's no way to create more humans. Because if you don't believe in that, then it's like, well, you're at fundamental odds with the way the world works and with how you continue existence of your gene pool down the line. Regardless of whether you're an evolutionist or you believe in God, or if you believe in both or any of that stuff, it's like, it's the most fundamental truth to our existence in a lot of ways. All of our biological like impulses are geared towards that. And the role of a parent in a kid's life is to help them, because they emerge into this world with no concept of necessarily truth or what languages or how to make sense of the world. And the fundamental job of a parent is to help a kid make sense of that, to establish modals of thinking, to be able to, parse information and decide, hey, this is in line with my objectives and my best interest versus what is not. And this person is correct in a way that if this scenario does occur, you have failed as a parent, because somewhere along earlier in the line, you did not protect your kid from a hostile philosophy that is hell-bent on destroying them, or you didn't do a good enough job, or you actively lied to them about the realities of their biological state, and now they're in this scenario. So yeah, you have failed as a parent if you find yourself in this way, but it's not because you told them truth or something like that. It's because you've actually done the antithesis of that. You've confused them. You've made less sense of the world to them. They are less able to function in society. And that's a great tragedy.
Yeah, I think understanding the core of transgenderism is key here, right? There are very, very few cases, they're extremely rare, but there are some, when someone is born biologically one way, but their brain is wired to make them think they are the other gender. And there are specific medical aberrations where this is the case, right? And we have to recognize that aberrations do not set the rule. And when there is something that is a medical like defect from the norm, you don't go in and enable and fix that. If your body was born with a massive like tumor on your arm, you don't start a campaign saying we need tumor acceptance and we need to have people embrace that. And if that's how they identify, we want to let them grow that tumor. Like, no, like, clearly on the one hand, you don't want to mock and ridicule and drive people who have like a tumorous growth on their arm. You don't want to make them feel bad, but you also don't want to say like, hey, let's be complacent. Let's appreciate and let's encourage that. Like, the encouragement should be, no, let's make sure that this is taken care of medically, right? And if it is, and if it's benign and they have to live that way, like, don't mock them for that, but also don't recognize that like that is, a set apart thing from the normal. It is technically a bad thing. It doesn't make them less of a person. It doesn't make them worth less or evil or anything like that, of course. But you do recognize that that is an aberration from the norm. And so with the transgenderism that is sweeping our nation, we recognize that most of these cases are not actually medically, biologically confused cases. It's very much a social contagion in so many ways. You look at the peer pressure that children go through in school to conform in certain ways, to try to accept certain identities, what the cultural zeitgeist is, and then you recognize that, oh, this is a problem that people are being driven to either through social pressure, through mental disease, or in the rare case through a biological disorder. And which mental disease can be, but I'm strictly speaking, of course, of the DNA genetic aspect. So, but once you recognize that, then of course the idea of affirming all these things like you just did would be insane. It would be just ridiculous. And like you said, as a parent, you would be making your kids' lives so much worse by affirming that. And so I think the root of the matter is that we've, even more so than general LGB type issues, we have taken something that is just a physical anomaly, and we've tried to make it into an identity, and that is a huge problem. And I think it's really messing kids up. It's one of the reasons why, like, you don't actually see better rates of depression or suicide after transition after a couple of years, because you've given someone what they think they want for a short term until they realize they're still not happy, they're still confused, they're still plagued with mental anguish, because that wasn't the root of the issue. So I think that this is one of the most dangerous perspectives you can take when it comes to your children's well-being.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Okay, we've got a video here, so we're going to cue that up, and this is Fox commentators talking about the debate. We're going to start with the debate, we're going to end with the debate, and so let's see if we can get that queued up.
And then you move on over to the third state, South Carolina, and look at this, 53% majority support for Trump.
That is undeniable. And what's also undeniable, to Marie's point, is Nikki Haley's position under him in every state, where it's the third place that sort of revolves. And I thought, if I could just give some sort of general thoughts about last night, for candidates who continue saying that Americans deserve better as we discuss policy issues, it's frankly disappointing and unpalatable that we keep being subjected to what I see has become behavior as a court jester. And when Vivek talked about, wisdom versus experience, is it hubris where he thinks the wisdom is himself? Like, there has to be a line drawn. I just think that the behavior is unbecoming of anyone who thinks they should sit in the Oval Office. And given the fact of how many years we've been subjected to unruly behavior that's disheartening, disappointing, exhausting over and over again, that just underscores that. That just feeds into it. That does not give us a refreshing change of events. And the sooner that he steps out, then the sooner that we can get down to actually contrasting. Respectfully, I think the neocon label is one that people want Nikki Haley to have, but I think she's far different than that. And I think the two candidates up there whose policies should really be contrasted against each other, compared to a nuanced, thoughtful degree, and think about the messenger and the package and the experience, is Nikki Haley and DeSantis. And everything else is just noise. Yeah. And the sooner they realize that, the better for all of us Americans who are trying so hard, so thoughtfully to make real decisions.
And those two are at center stage where the polls have them. Dagan, the first stop on our journey to.
Okay. Before I hand over the reins to you here, I just want to ask you one thing. From like the first moment she started talking right up until she got to the point of saying it needs to just be DeSantis and Haley, what did she say? What was her point before that? Did she say anything of substance?
I was trying to think of one other than like mean words. Yeah. You shouldn't have mean words.
It was just, he's just like, for someone who says we need a change of pace and like, a foreign policy experience is hubris, but like, because he's the wisdom. It was word salad. There was nothing there.
What's funny? I mean, not funny, but what's terrifying about it is she delivers it really well, right? So you're listening like, oh, this woman is well spoken, but she is saying nothing, and it's really is revealed because you said that. I was like, oh crap, did I miss something key? I was like,
No.
nope, didn't miss anything. The gist of her argument is, well, Vivek says things and makes people uncomfortable that hold a certain viewpoint that is wrong, and because he's calling them out and saying, hey, they are responsible for the deaths of millions of people and the misery of millions more, and they would send you and your daughter and your son over to a desert to die to get a few more dollars in their bank account. Like, that makes me uncomfortable. It's like, okay, if that's so egregious and so awful and so wrong, like, shouldn't you be able to like rebut that attack? And what's so funny about like all the debates, like Chris Christie's really interesting to me from just a pure, like, his existence is interesting to me because like, the only reason he ever is included in these debates is to be a torpedo against, or an attempted torpedo against people that the establishment doesn't like. And they think that like he's like super good at this, but the only reason he's ever been like good at it is because he's never run up against anyone that actually has any command of the facts. And so he just relies on this like, oh, like I'm gonna get you for this or get you for that, and make that happen. And it's like, yeah, but they're not actually making any arguments. So Vivek will say, hey, you don't know the 3 provinces in Ukraine that you would send troops to or give billions of dollars to, or whatever. Like, that shows your foreign policy experience is not actually wisdom. And like any reasonable person can infer from that, it's like, well, like we were talking about in the first take, it's not that she couldn't just name those 3 places. It's that she advocates so strongly for certain types of actions. And then the defining feature of her candidacy is that she's been to the United Nations and she's been an ambassador and she has all of these types of foreign policy credentials. And that's why she's going to be so awesome. It's like, okay, well, if you've hinged all that on there and then you can't get a simple thing like this right, like maybe you're not actually legit. Maybe you're not the real thing. Maybe you're a fraud. But no one will actually contend with his point about that. They'll just say like, oh, like it kind of made me feel uncomfortable. And that's, I mean, you and I've talked about it. I think that's one of the downsides of Ramaswamy is that like he kind of comes off as kind of glib, and like his tone of voice and the way he delivers things will turn people off that don't choose to see past that and just see to the logic of the arguments that he's making. And that's where someone a little bit more charismatic would do a good job. Trump, like, what's funny about Trump is he makes him and Vivek are similar in like the points that they make and the insights that they have. I think Vivek's a lot smarter, obviously, than Trump. But Trump is able to deliver it in a way that is like almost endearing. And I think that's why so many people liked him. It's also weird that a lot of people disliked him because that same endearing fashion that he can convey these things is also what made him so dislikable to other folks. But Vivek kind of just in general makes people feel uncomfortable, even though it's like he's saying the right stuff. And so anyways, this woman on this Fox News show is literally saying like, he kind of makes me feel uncomfortable. And, you know, we've got 2 candidates up here who, you know, the difference between them is one is, you know, is a Subway sandwich with white bread and the other is a Subway sandwich with Italian bread. You know, that's like the differences that we can substantially talk about, and they're different. It's like, yeah, DeSantis and Haley are like not too different when it comes down to a lot of things. DeSantis was a little bit better on certain COVID policies, and he's kind of chameleoned his way around to fairly good foreign policy. But like at the end of the day, they're 2 sides of the same coin. So the crux of our argument, like you were saying, is I feel bad when he says these things. So that means he shouldn't be in there.
Exactly. She could not rebut anything. She just said, and I loved when she brought up, you know, was he saying the hubris of saying that he was the wisdom him? It's like, no, he was saying that experience doesn't equal wisdom. That's what he was saying.
That's such a good thing to like talk about. Like,
yeah, it's so funny. So if you're saying, hey, these people have said they have experience, it's not wisdom. This is the correct approach. You're not inherently saying you're wise, but you are saying that we need to have a different course of correction. And of course, you would think that you should be like, if you're running for president, you should think you're the most qualified person for the job with the best views. So that's such a non-issue to say. Like, do you think you're smart? Yes. Wow, he's so arrogant. Like, no, if you don't think you're smart, you probably shouldn't run for president. If you don't think you have the right wise foreign policy, then you probably shouldn't have a foreign policy position you do. What a stupid non-issue thing to say. I mean, like, and you're right. She packaged it very like convincingly so that you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, it is a little hubristic of him to to say that he's wisdom versus the experience. And it's like, wake up for a second. Nikki Haley thinks she has foreign policy wisdom. She thinks she's wise in that area. That's also hubristic. The difference, of course, being that, like you pointed out, Vivek comes off very abrasively to some people. Rightfully so, I think. But if you're more inclined to like them, I can see why that would definitely rub you the wrong way. And like you said, like the last bit of it too, it made me laugh because I think that you could make her argument better than she did, as to say why you should narrow it down to hear Haley and DeSantis. You could say, like, both of these people are polling relatively well. They're seen as the most likely anti-Trump votes, and frankly, in a primary where Donald Trump is running, Ramaswamy is not relevant anyway. So let's narrow it down to the two realistic alternatives to Trump, so that we can hear what they have to say. That'd be a much more convincing way. What she instead said was, we want to hear the contrast and difference between these two people. Everything else is noise. You're just saying you want to shut the Overton window. You want to close it down to Haley DeSantis because Vivek is actually introducing ideas that would contrast and conflict with these people, and you don't want that. So if you actually care about contrasting ideas and hearing a variety of opinions, you would want Vivek to stay because he brings something entirely different to the table. But instead, she said, well, we need to hear the contrasts and differences, so let's close the Overton window so that we can focus in on the minute differences between DeSantis and Haley, which is just a very funny way to say you need to focus on contrast by getting rid of the biggest contrast there is.
Yeah, and like the gall of these there's just so much, like, the gall of her to talk about hubris in relation to neocon warhawks like Nikki Haley and Dick Cheney and John McCain, all neocons. Nikki Haley is lock in step with John McCain and Dick Cheney, like people we all consider to be neocons. I think everyone would consider them to be neocons, warhawks. Like the gall to say, like, oh, Vivek has hubris because he's saying there's a difference between experience and wisdom, and then not like look at the glaring log of hubris in the eyes of the neocons over the past 40 years about how they thought they could reshape the world, that we have this unipolar moment where we could spread democracy, to goat herders in Afghanistan and remake that country that has, a process that took almost 500 years of democracy and republicanism in the West, we could do in 5 short years in Afghanistan. It's like, yeah, you're not a serious person if you can't acknowledge that. That is like a way more glaring hubris, and it is also much more devastating because it costs human lives and it totally destroyed an entire region of the world. So it's just like when she said that, I just couldn't believe it, because I think like maybe the defining feature of the neocons of the 21st century is their hubris about how things would go and how they knew, how much they knew about the Middle East and world affairs, and how they could enact, these clever little types of military invasions, actually big types of military invasions to steer the world and, fight these proxy wars and fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. It's like, yeah, the world is a less safe place from the hubris of the neocons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all I've got cool. On this. But it just made me laugh to hear that. And then this was posted, I was telling you before, as like Fox News crushes Vivek. Like, if this is the best they've got, that's pathetic, because there was no response to the content of what he said. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We always appreciate comments and likes and all that sort of stuff. Make sure to follow us, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.